After Colonel Whitmore publicly blames her for his son's death, a group of co-workers decides to finish the humiliation. She feels something that should not be there. A pulse. Faint. Almost gone. No one else noticed, because no one else ever touched him the way she just did. Alone, with no team, what she does in the next few minutes will not only expose a lie about his death, it will expose exactly who she really is.
If this story pulled you in, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us the moment you knew she was more than a nurse, because what she does next in that morgue will stay with you. The paperwork on the clipboard said Atlas Whitmore was dead at 1400 hours. Harper Quinn had signed nothing on that page, yet somehow her name kept surfacing anyway, in every whisper that moved down the 7th floor of St. Agnes Naval Hospital, like smoke under a door. She had learned, over 11 months at St. Agnes, to walk the halls with her shoulders curved inward and her eyes fixed somewhere near her own shoes. It was easier that way. A small woman in oversized teal scrubs, sleeves rolled twice at the wrist, drew far less attention than a woman who stood tall and looked people in the eye. Harper had made herself small on purpose. She had done it for almost a year now, and until this morning, it had worked. Colonel Daniel Whitmore did not care how small she made herself. Charleston had seemed like a safe place to disappear when she first arrived. A mid-sized naval hospital, a city full of tourists and history, a staff too busy with its own routines to ask questions about a new nurse who kept her file thin and her personal life thinner. Harper had chosen St. Agnes for exactly that reason. Nobody here knew her before the scars, before the tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve, before the careful discipline she had spent a year disguising as ordinary competence. She had built a life here out of small, deliberate choices, and every one of those choices existed to keep her invisible. Atlas Whitmore had arrived 4 days earlier, medevaced in from an operation nobody at St. Agnes was cleared to discuss, his chart marked with restrictions that kept even senior staff from asking too many questions. Harper had been assigned to his room on the overnight rotation, and something about the quiet authority in his unconscious face, the scarring on his hands that matched patterns she recognized from a life she rarely let herself remember, had made her more careful with him than with any other patient in 11 months. Vitals checked herself instead of trusting the automated readouts. Positioning adjusted by hand, watching for the smallest signs of distress. Harper had done, in short, exactly what her training told her to do, the training that had nothing to do with nursing school. He died on a Tuesday afternoon, according to the chart. Harper had not believed it then either, though she had no proof beyond a feeling she could not justify to anyone, a wrongness in the numbers that nobody else seemed to notice. He found her outside the surgical wing, in front of 2 attending physicians, a resident, and a cluster of nurses pretending to review charts they were not actually reading. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It carried the particular quiet violence of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders that people obeyed without question. "You were the last one in that room," he said. "You were the last person to touch my son, and now he is gone." Harper did not answer right away. Answering too quickly, in her experience, only invited more. "I did everything the protocol required, Colonel," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "I called it in the moment the monitors changed, Dr. Pierce made the call to stop. Dr. Pierce is a decorated trauma surgeon." Whitmore stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, close enough to smell the coffee and grief on his breath. "You are a nurse who has been here less than a year. Nobody knows where you came from. Nobody knows what you did before this, and now my son is on a table downstairs with a sheet over his face. Sir, I understand you are in pain, but I did not," she started, and got no further before he cut her off. "You never looked at me. You only looked down." His voice cracked on the last word, the first true break in 30 years of command posture, and for a moment Harper almost reached for his arm, almost let herself forget the 11 months of careful invisibility. "The whole time my son was dying in that bed, you never once looked me in the eye and told me the truth." He turned and walked away before she could answer, and the hallway exhaled with him. Nurses returning to their charts, doctors returning to their rounds, all of them careful not to look directly at the woman left standing in the space where the accusation had landed. Harper Quinn had been called worse things in worse places. She told herself that, as she walked to the supply closet and gripped the edge of the metal shelf until her knuckles went white, until the tremor that always lived just beneath her skin settled back down where she kept it hidden. She had learned control before she had learned most other things in life. Control was the one skill nobody at St. Agnes had ever seen her use, because using it meant showing something she could not afford to show. Dr. Nolan Pierce found her 20 minutes later in the break room, pretending to drink coffee that had gone cold. "The Colonel is not wrong to be angry," Pierce said. He had the kind of handsome, sculpted face that photographed well for hospital fundraisers, and a way of tilting his chin that made every sentence sound like a verdict. "Whether or not he is right to blame you, that is a separate question. Optics matter, Nurse Quinn. And right now the optics are that a junior nurse with no notable background was alone in that room when a decorated operator flatlined. I followed every protocol. I am sure you believe that." He set down his own cup with a small, precise click. "There will be a review, administrative, not disciplinary for now. Try not to make it worse by discussing this with the other staff." She wanted to tell him that she had not discussed anything with anyone, that the story moving through St. Agnes like current through wire had built itself out of nothing but her silence and other people's need for someone to blame. She did not say it. Saying it would have required raising her voice, and raising her voice was a door she had spent a year keeping shut. "May I ask you something, Dr. Pierce?" Harper kept her eyes on the cold coffee rather than on his face. "You called the time of death. Did the monitors flatline before you made that call, or after?" Pierce's expression flickered, so briefly that a less attentive observer might have missed it entirely. "The monitors showed exactly what they needed to show, Nurse Quinn. The sequence of events is that Atlas Whitmore suffered catastrophic internal injuries consistent with his deployment, that his body could not sustain the damage, and that he passed at 14:02. That is the sequence, and it is the sequence that will appear in every official document related to this case. I would advise you to remember it exactly that way." He left without waiting for her response, and Harper stood alone in the break room with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that she had just been given an instruction rather than an explanation. The rumor reached its cruelest form by the end of her shift. She heard it from Denise, one of the younger nurses, who delivered it with the particular relish of someone repeating gossip she found delicious. Marcus Hale and two of the orderlies from the night shift, Rafe and Dominic, had decided among themselves that Nurse Quinn needed a lesson. Something about respect. Something about knowing your place after you cost a war hero his life. Harper should have gone home. She told herself later, in the version of the night she replayed 100 times, that she should have simply walked to her car and driven away from St. Agnes and let the whole ugly week wash over her from a safe distance. Instead, she went down to the morgue level to retrieve a chart she had left near the intake desk, because leaving anything unfinished had never been something she could tolerate, not since long before she ever wore scrubs. Marcus was waiting by the elevator. "Look who it is," he said, and there was Rafe behind him, and Dominic leaning against the cold steel door of the morgue itself, arms crossed, grinning like a man who had been promised entertainment. "I need to get the Whitmore chart," Harper said. Her voice stayed level. Years of practice kept it level even as her pulse climbed. "The Whitmore chart." Marcus repeated the words like they tasted good in his mouth. "You know what I think, Quinn? I think you liked him. I think that is why you would not let anyone else touch him, territorial little nurse, guarding her favorite patient. Move, please." "Or what?" Dominic pushed off the door, and Harper felt the old instinct rise in her chest, the one she had buried under a year of small steps and lowered eyes, the instinct that recognized a threat assessment happening in real time. 3 men, 1 exit behind them. No cameras in this corridor, she remembered that from the layout. Filed away the way she filed away every exit in every building she had ever walked into. She did not get the chance to use any of it. Rafe grabbed her arm before she registered the movement, and the morgue door swung open under Dominic's shoulder, and the 3 of them were laughing now, actually laughing. The sound bouncing off tile and steel in a way that made Harper's stomach drop through the floor. "Since you loved him so much," Marcus said, "maybe you should say a proper goodbye." They half carried, half threw her across the room, toward the single occupied table near the back wall, the sheet pulled up over a shape that Harper's mind refused, for one merciful second, to identify. She hit the edge of the table and lost her balance entirely, and her body came down across the covered form beneath the sheet, chest to chest, her hands slamming flat against cold skin through thin cotton. "Go ahead," Rafe said, from somewhere behind the ringing in her ears. "Lie with him. Maybe you will finally learn what death feels like." The door swung shut. Their laughter faded down the hallway, already moving on, already forgetting, the way cruelty always did once it had gotten what it wanted. Harper lay still for 3 full seconds, humiliation burning up through her chest into her throat, and she almost let herself cry. Right there, alone in the cold, because 11 months of swallowing every insult had finally reached its limit. Then her hands, still pressed flat against Atlas Whitmore's chest, registered something they had no business registering. A pulse. Faint. Slow. Nearly gone, buried under skin gone cool from hours in refrigeration. But there, unmistakably there, the smallest flutter against her palm like a moth trapped behind glass. Harper went still in a different way now, every trace of shame gone from her body, replaced by something colder and infinitely more focused. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery, counted, waited, counted again. 4 beats a minute. Maybe 5. A heart doing everything in its power to stop, and somehow, impossibly, still refusing. "No," she whispered, and pulled the sheet back from his face. Atlas Whitmore's skin held the waxy pallor of the truly dying, lips faintly blue, eyes closed, chest so still that anyone glancing at the chart, anyone trusting the paperwork over their own hands, would have called it certain. But Harper had not trusted paperwork over her hands in a very long time. Screaming for help was an option. Running for the door and shouting for anyone at all, was another. And some part of her, the part still raw from the Colonel's voice in the hallway, from Pierce's cold verdict, from Marcus and Rafe and Dominic laughing as the door swung shut, warned her exactly how that would go. She could already hear it. Nurse Quinn, hysterical again. Nurse Quinn, claiming a dead man is alive, 3 days after losing him on her own watch. Nobody would believe her fast enough. And fast right now was the only thing that mattered. Her hands stopped shaking. That was the strange part, the part she would think about later. The tremor she had spent a year hiding, the one that surfaced whenever anyone watched her too closely, simply vanished. And in its place came a stillness she recognized from somewhere far older than St. Agnes Naval Hospital. Somewhere she had buried even deeper than the humiliation. "Stay with me," she said quietly, to a man the world had already declared gone. "You are not done yet. Neither am I." The morgue had no crash cart, no monitors, none of the machinery a hospital built around the business of saving lives. Because a morgue existed for the opposite purpose entirely. Harper had nothing but her hands, her training, and roughly 90 seconds before a heart beating 4 times a minute stopped beating altogether. She tilted his head, checked the airway, found it clear, and began compressions with a precision that came from someplace deeper than any nursing certification, someplace that measured force and rhythm the way a metronome measured time, not counting 1,000 to 1,000 the way the textbooks taught, but moving in a cadence her body had known long before it knew anything about hospitals. "Come on," she breathed, between compressions, and did not notice that her voice had dropped an octave lower, steadier, the frightened register gone entirely. "You did not survive whatever put you in that bed just to die on a steel table because everyone stopped looking. 30 compressions. She checked his pulse again. Still there. Barely. A flicker instead of a flat line. She tilted his head back, sealed her mouth to his, and gave 2 slow breaths, watching his chest for the rise that would tell her the airway was truly clear. It rose. Somewhere down the hallway, a door opened, and Harper heard voices approaching, and made a decision in the space of half a second that she would examine and re-examine for the rest of her life. She did not stop the compressions to call out. She used the last of her breath instead to shout a single word, sharp enough to cut through steel and concrete. "Code!" The word detonated down the corridor. Feet began moving, fast, and Harper kept her hands locked in rhythm against Atlas Whitmore's chest. 30 more compressions, 2 more breaths, refusing to let a single beat slip, because she understood something the rest of the hospital did not yet understand. This was not a resuscitation. This was an argument with the paperwork, with the Colonel's grief, with Dr. Pierce's cold verdict, with Marcus and Rafe and Dominic's cruelty, and she intended to win it. Dr. Pierce arrived first, breathless, A crash cart wheeled in behind him by a night nurse whose face had gone the color of the tile. "What in God's name are you doing?" Pierce demanded. And then his eyes found the monitor a resident was hurriedly wheeling into place. The lead slapped onto Atlas Whitmore's chest with shaking hands, and the line on the screen that should have stayed flat instead jumped, faint and erratic, but undeniably a rhythm. The room went silent except for the beep, weak and irregular, but real. "He has a pulse," Harper said, not looking up, her hand still moving. "He never lost it completely. Whatever reading you took 3 days ago, it was wrong, or it was manipulated, and I do not have time to argue about which right now. I need epinephrine, and I need this table converted into a resuscitation bay in the next 90 seconds. Pierce stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of pause that would define later, whether he was a man who could admit error or a man who could not. Then years of training took over, the way training always eventually did, even in men whose pride outweighed their instincts. "Get him upstairs," he snapped at the resident. "Now, ICU 3, prep the room. I want a full panel the second we have him stable." They moved him fast, Harper's hands never leaving his chest until the gurney was ready, her voice calling out numbers and observations with a clarity that made the resident glance at her twice. Something in her tone that did not match the timid nurse he had watched shrink through hallways for 11 months. The resident who had wheeled in the monitor, a young man named Foster who had been at St. Agnes barely 6 months, stared at Harper the entire ride up the elevator, unable to reconcile the woman calling out numbers with clinical authority against the timid nurse he had watched flinch through 11 months of hallway conversations. He did not ask anything, but Harper noticed the way he kept glancing at her hands, as though they had become evidence of something the rest of her had spent a year hiding. By the time they reached the ICU, word had already begun to travel, the way word always traveled through a hospital faster than any official channel could contain it. Colonel Daniel Whitmore reached the corridor outside ICU 3 within 4 minutes, still in the same uniform from that morning, his face a battlefield of disbelief and something that looked almost like fear of hoping too soon. "Tell me what I am hearing is not a cruel joke," he said to the first person he found, which happened to be Harper, standing at the observation window with her hands still faintly trembling, now that the emergency had passed and left room for feeling again. "Your son has a pulse, Colonel." She kept her voice steady, even though everything in her wanted to look away from him, the way she had looked away from everyone for 11 months. "It is weak. It is not stable. But he is alive, and I do not believe he was ever truly gone." "That is not possible." Whitmore's hands closed into fists at his sides. "I saw the declaration. I saw the time of death. I identified my son's body." "I know." Harper met his eyes fully for the first time since he had accused her in the surgical hallway, and something in her gaze made the colonel go still, the way a man goes still when he senses, without yet understanding why, that he is looking at someone entirely different from who he thought he was looking at. "And I think someone wanted you to see exactly that and stop looking any further." Before Whitmore could answer, the doors to ICU 3 swung open, and a man Harper had never seen before stepped into the corridor, dressed in civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise a soldier's bearing, dust from a long flight still clinging to his boots. "Colonel Whitmore." The man's voice carried the particular flatness of someone accustomed to delivering hard news in worse places than hospital corridors. "I am Master Chief Bishop. I served with your son. I flew in the moment I heard he went down, and I am not leaving this hospital until I understand exactly what happened to him." Whitmore's shoulders dropped half an inch, the posture of a man grateful for one moment not to be the only one demanding answers. Bishop's eyes moved past the colonel and landed on Harper, on the drying spots of exertion at her collar, on the steadiness with which she stood despite clearly having just come from something enormous. He studied her the way Harper recognized instantly, the way men like him studied a room before deciding whether it was safe, cataloging details most people never noticed. "You are the nurse who called the code," he said. It was not a question. "Harper Quinn. You did compressions on a body the paperwork called dead for 3 days." Bishop's gaze dropped briefly to her hands, still faintly trembling from adrenaline, then back up to her face. "Where did you learn to hold that rhythm? That is not textbook CPR. That is combat casualty rhythm. I have seen exactly 3 people move like that in 15 years, and none of them were hospital nurses." Harper felt the old instinct rise again, the one that told her to shrink, to deflect, to make herself small enough that the question would slide past her unanswered. For the first time in 11 months, She did not obey it. "I do not know what you mean," she said instead, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. And Bishop heard the gap in it immediately, the way trained men always heard the gap between a lie and the truth sitting just beneath it. "Those are not a nurse's hands," Bishop said quietly, almost to himself, though he made certain she heard every word. "That is battlefield training." Atlas Whitmore's vital signs stabilized enough by midnight that Dr. Pierce ordered a full neurological workup, unwilling to say the word miracle aloud, but clearly thinking it every time he looked at the monitor. Harper stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift, not because anyone asked her to, but because some part of her refused to leave a fight she had only half won. She found Bishop in the family waiting area outside ICU 3, sitting with his forearms braced on his knees, watching the door with the stillness of a man who had spent years learning how to wait without wasting a single ounce of energy on impatience. "You should go home, Nurse Quinn," he said without looking up. "You gave that boy back 3 days he was not supposed to have. That is enough for one night. I keep thinking about the paperwork." Harper sat 2 chairs away, close enough to talk, far enough to leave herself room to leave if she needed to. "Time of death, 4 in the afternoon, declared by Dr. Pierce. "Except a heart does not stop and then keep beating 4 times a minute for 3 days by accident. Something happened in that room before I ever walked in, and I do not think it was natural." Bishop turned his head slowly. "You are saying someone tried to kill him and made it look like his body gave out. I am saying the numbers do not add up, and numbers are the one thing I trust more than people right now." She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, the tremor threatening to return now that the emergency adrenaline had drained out of her system, leaving exhaustion and something rawer underneath it. "I was blamed for his death, publicly, by the colonel, in front of half the surgical staff. If someone wanted a scapegoat in place before anyone asked real questions, I was standing right there, ready-made. You think this goes higher than 3 orderlies pushing you into a morgue for a cruel joke?" Harper hesitated. She had not told him about the morgue, about Marcus, about the sheet and the laughter and the cold weight of Atlas Whitmore's chest under her hands. She had said none of it, and yet Bishop spoke of it as though he had watched the entire scene unfold. "How do you know about that?" "Because Rafe Delgado has a mouth on him, and mouths like that talk in break rooms. And I have spent the last hour listening to every conversation in this hospital that I could get close enough to hear." Something dangerous moved behind Bishop's calm expression, banked and controlled, but unmistakably present. 3 men threw a woman onto what they believed was a corpse, as a punishment for daring to exist near their guilt. And that woman found a pulse nobody else in this building bothered to look for in 3 days. I have been in enough dark places to know when something is being covered up, Nurse Quinn, and this has the shape of exactly that. Before Harper could answer, the ICU doors opened, and a nurse Harper did not recognize hurried out, face pale, eyes scanning the waiting area until they landed on Harper. "Nurse Quinn, you need to come. Now. Dr. Pierce is asking for you specifically. He says the readings do not make sense without you there to explain what you did in the morgue." Harper rose, and Bishop rose with her, matching her pace toward the doors without asking permission. The way a man moves when he has already decided he is not leaving a wounded teammate's side, regardless of hospital policy. Nobody stopped him. Something in his posture made it clear that stopping him would require more force than anyone at St. Agnes currently had available. Inside ICU 3, Atlas Whitmore lay pale but breathing on his own, the ventilator standing unused at the bedside, monitors tracing a rhythm that had climbed from 4 beats a minute to 68, weak but steady, stubborn in exactly the way his father's voice had been stubborn in the surgical hallway that morning. Dr. Pierce stood at the foot of the bed, staring at a printed strip of paper in his hands, like it had personally betrayed him. The time of death entry in his chart was logged at 14:02, Pierce said, without preamble, his usual polish stripped away by something that looked almost like fear. "I did not make that entry, Nurse Quinn. I was in surgery on another floor at 14:02. Someone used my credentials." The room went very quiet. "Who had access to your login?" Bishop asked, and the question landed with the weight of a man who already suspected he would not like the answer. Pierce's jaw tightened. "I do not know. I did not think anyone would need to." Harper looked at the monitor, at the stubborn 68 beats climbing toward 70, and felt the last of her carefully maintained smallness crack clean through, the way ice finally gives after holding weight it was never meant to hold. Someone wanted him dead on paper, she said quietly. And they wanted someone else standing close enough to take the blame when the truth came out. I do not think that was an accident, Dr. Pierce, and I do not think it is finished. Whitmore appeared in the doorway then, having heard enough of the exchange to understand its shape, if not its full meaning. His eyes moving from the monitor to his son's chest, rising and falling to the woman he had accused in front of half the hospital that same morning. "Colonel," Harper said, before he could speak, before the old instinct could pull her gaze back down to the floor, "your son did not die because of anything I did. And I believe someone in this building wanted both of us to think that he had, for reasons I do not yet understand. I intend to find out what those reasons are." For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Then Bishop spoke, quiet, absolute, the voice of a man who had made his decision and would not be talked out of it. "Whatever this is, Nurse Quinn, you are not finding it out alone." Colonel Whitmore moved to his son's bedside, his hand hovering above Atlas's arm, as though touching him might reveal the entire night to be a dream. When his fingers finally closed around his son's hand and felt real warmth returning against his grip, something in the colonel's face broke open. The command posture gone, replaced by nothing more or less than a father again. "I owe you an apology, Nurse Quinn." He did not look away from his son as he said it. "I said something to you this morning that I cannot take back. I looked at you and saw someone convenient to blame. Because blaming a stranger is easier than accepting that I might have missed something, that this hospital might have missed something, in the hours when it mattered most. You do not owe me anything yet, Colonel." Harper kept her voice steady, though something in her chest loosened slightly at the words, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. "Not until we understand exactly what happened in that room 3 days ago, and who benefited from everyone believing your son was gone." Dr. Pierce set the printed strip of paper down on the counter with visible reluctance, as though letting go of it meant letting go of his own credibility along with it. "I will pull every access log from that day, every login, every badge swipe, every override on the monitoring equipment. If someone used my credentials to falsify a time of death, I want to know exactly how they did it, and I want to know before the review board asks me questions I cannot yet answer." Bishop had not moved from his position near the door, arms crossed, weight settled in the particular stillness of a man who had learned patience the hard way, in places where impatience got people killed. His eyes stayed on Harper longer than strictly necessary, cataloging something in her posture that had shifted since the moment he first saw her in the hallway. The shrinking woman from that afternoon, slowly giving way to someone else entirely. Someone whose hands did not shake even now, hours after the kind of exertion that would have left most people trembling. "There is something else you should know, Colonel," Bishop said finally, still watching Harper. "Your son was not the only casualty from that operation with unexplained gaps in his medical record. I flew here the moment I heard he went down because 2 other men from our unit had similar complications after transferring through separate facilities. I did not think much of it until tonight. Now I think it deserves a closer look." Harper felt the shape of the night rearrange itself around that sentence, the small crisis of one falsified death certificate widening into something with edges she could not yet see. She thought of the sheet pulled back from a waxen, still face, of Marcus and Rafe and Dominic laughing as the door swung shut, of Pierce's careful instruction in the break room hours earlier, and understood that the humiliation in the hallway that morning had been only the smallest visible piece of something far larger. "Then we start in the morning," she said, "with the access logs, with whoever falsified that entry, and with whoever decided a dead man on a table made a more convenient story than a living one." Bishop nodded once, the gesture of a man closing a decision rather than opening a discussion. Outside the window, Charleston's night sky held steady and dark over the harbor, giving no indication that anything inside St. Agnes Naval Hospital had changed at all, though everyone standing in that room understood that very little would ever be the same again. "Doctor." Pierce pulled the access logs at 6 in the morning, before most of the day shift had even clocked in, and what he found waiting on the screen made him call Harper's cell phone directly, instead of routing the information through any official channel. "My credentials were used to log the time of death at 14:02, Pierce said. The moment she answered, his voice stripped of its usual polish. "But the badge swipe into the records terminal that morning belonged to Marcus Hale. He used my login from a terminal in the basement level, nowhere near where I was operating that afternoon." Harper sat up in bed, sleep gone instantly. Marcus does not have clearance for that terminal. No, he does not. Which means someone gave him the access, or he found a way around it, and either possibility is worse than the last. Pierce exhaled, and Harper heard, for the first time since she had met him, something that sounded almost like fear in the sound. There is more. The basement terminal logged 3 additional entries that same hour, all related to patient transport authorizations. Someone was preparing paperwork to move Atlas Whitmore off-site, the same afternoon his death was recorded. Move him where? The authorization does not specify a facility. It specifies a transport company. Meridian Secure Medical Transfer. I have never heard of them, and neither has our compliance office. Harper closed her eyes for a moment, running through the timeline again in her mind, the way she had learned to run through timelines long before she understood what a hospital shift schedule even looked like. If the transport paperwork was filed the same hour as the death certificate, then whoever arranged it believed the 2 events would happen together. A declared death, followed within hours by a quiet removal of the body under a transport company nobody would think to question. No family present, no further scrutiny. It would have worked perfectly if I had not walked into that morgue. You mean if they had not thrown you into that morgue, Pierce said. I heard what happened last night. I did not say anything about it earlier because I did not know how to reconcile what those 3 men did with what came out of it. They did not save him, Dr. Pierce. I did. What they did was cruelty, plain and simple, and it happened to collide with a truth they had no intention of uncovering. Harper pulled her hair back with quick, efficient movements, the same economy of motion she used for every task that required speed without waste. I am coming in. By the time she arrived at St. Agnes, the hospital's administrative wing had already begun circling its own kind of wagons. The parking garage felt different that morning, the ordinary bustle of shift change replaced by something quieter and more watchful. Nurses and orderlies alike glancing at Harper as she passed with expressions she could not fully read, admiration tangled with suspicion, gratitude tangled with the particular discomfort people felt toward anyone who had proven, overnight, to be someone other than who they appeared. She found herself summoned to the office of Deputy Administrator Whitfield before her shift technically began, a summons that arrived with the particular chill of a meeting designed to end careers rather than begin conversations. The office itself told her everything she needed to know before Whitfield spoke a single word. The desk cleared of anything personal, a single folder positioned at its center with the deliberate placement of a prop arranged for effect rather than a document meant to be read. Nurse Quinn. Whitfield did not offer her a seat. I understand you performed an unauthorized resuscitation attempt on a patient whose death had already been formally declared by an attending physician. I performed CPR on a patient with a detectable pulse, which is standard emergency protocol, regardless of prior paperwork. The paperwork existed for a reason. Dr. Pierce, 3 additional physicians, and the patient's own family had been informed of his death. Your actions created significant liability exposure for this hospital, to say nothing of the emotional trauma inflicted on the Whitmore family by resurrecting false hope around a body that, by every clinical measure available to you at the time, should have remained deceased. Harper kept her hands folded, kept her voice level, though something colder than fear was beginning to settle into her chest. Are you telling me I made an error by saving a living patient? I am telling you that you acted outside established protocol, and that this hospital is required to review whether your license should reflect a formal reprimand. Whitfield's eyes did not waver. I understand emotions are high given the circumstances, but you will not discuss the details of last night's incident with any member of the press, any military personnel outside the patient's immediate chain of command, or any hospital staff not directly involved in his ongoing care. Do you understand these terms? I understand that someone in this building falsified a time of death and arranged an unauthorized transport for a living patient, and I understand that you are choosing to focus your review on the nurse who caught it. Whitfield's expression did not change, which told Harper more than any answer could have. This hospital has a reputation to protect, Nurse Quinn. A falsified death certificate, if that is truly what occurred, is a matter for our legal department and our compliance office to handle through proper channels, quietly, and with full discretion. It is not a matter for a junior nurse to investigate on her own initiative, regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved. With respect, Administrator Whitfield, a man is alive right now because I did not wait for proper channels. And I am grateful for that outcome, genuinely. Whitfield's tone softened by exactly 1 degree, calculated and brief. But gratitude does not erase liability. And liability is what this hospital's board will be asking me about within the week. I need you to understand that whatever review follows is not personal. It is procedural. It felt personal an hour ago when you told me not to discuss it with anyone. Because the fewer people speculating about what happened in that morgue, the more control we retain over how this story reaches the public, the Whitmore family's attorneys, and the Navy's own review board. Whitfield finally softened her posture slightly, though her eyes stayed sharp. I am not your enemy, Nurse Quinn. I am simply the person whose job requires me to worry about consequences you do not have to consider from where you stand. The review will proceed as scheduled, Nurse Quinn. I would advise you to cooperate fully. She left the office with her pulse hammering beneath her calm exterior, the old instinct rising again, sharper this time. The instinct that recognized when an institution had decided which version of events it intended to protect. Bishop was waiting outside ICU 3 when she arrived, arms crossed, his expression unreadable until he saw her face. They are trying to make this about you, he said. It was not a question. They are trying to make this disappear, and I happen to be standing in the middle of it. Harper glanced through the observation window at Atlas, still pale, still fragile, but breathing steadily now, his vitals climbing towards something that resembled stability. Pierce found a transport authorization filed the same hour as the falsified death certificate. Someone wanted him moved off-site under a company called Meridian Secure Medical Transfer. Bishop went very still, the particular stillness Harper now recognized as the moment a soldier's mind shifted fully into threat assessment. I know that name. You have heard of it? I have heard rumors of it, in places I'm not supposed to repeat information from. He lowered his voice, glancing once down the corridor before continuing. Private contractors use shell transport companies to move personnel and material that official channels cannot account for. I have seen this pattern before, twice. Both times connected to units that came home with fewer men than they left with, and reports that never quite matched what the survivors remembered living through. If Atlas witnessed something during his last deployment that certain people wanted buried, and if he ended up here instead of on that transport, then someone made a very expensive mistake, and they will not simply walk away from it. What kind of operation are we talking about? The kind that does not appear on any briefing I have clearance to discuss with a hospital nurse, however much that nurse turns out to know about combat medicine. Bishop's expression carried no apology for the boundary, only certainty. What I can tell you is that 2 men from Atlas's unit transferred through separate medical facilities after that same operation, and both of their case files show irregularities nobody flagged until now, delayed diagnoses, missing imaging. One record lists a surgery date that does not match the hospital's own scheduling logs. I did not think much of any single discrepancy until tonight showed me what a single discrepancy can actually mean. You think they will try again? I think whoever arranged that transport authorization is not going to accept that their plan failed because a nurse felt a pulse nobody else bothered to check for. Bishop's jaw tightened. And I think we do not have much time before they attempt something considerably less subtle than falsified paperwork. Harper had spent the 2 hours before 11 that morning doing something she had not allowed herself to do in 11 months, walking the ICU corridor slowly, deliberately, cataloging exits, camera placements, stairwell access, the location of every security station within running distance, the way she used to walk a room before anything went wrong in it, rather than after. She noted the position of the fire stairwell nearest the loading dock, the blind spot behind the supply closet where no camera reached, the exact number of seconds it took to cross from the nurse's station to the ICU doors at a dead sprint. Bishop had watched her do it without comment, understanding immediately what the exercise meant, and had positioned himself near the nurse's station with the loose, unhurried posture of a man simply waiting on family, though his eyes tracked every person who moved through the corridor with the same attention Harper's did. If they come, she had told him quietly an hour earlier, they will come with paperwork before they come with anything worse. People like this always try the quiet version first. It is cheaper, and it draws less attention. And if the quiet version fails, then we will already know exactly who to stop, and exactly how far they are willing to go to finish what Marcus started. The men arrived at 11 that morning, dressed in the kind of unremarkable dark suits that federal agents wore in every procedural drama Harper had ever half-watched during a rare night off. credentials displayed with the crisp authority of documents meant to discourage close inspection rather than survive it. "We are here for patient Atlas Whitmore," the taller of the two men said to the charge nurse at the ICU desk. His ID badge identifying him as an agent with a Federal Medical Oversight Division that Harper had never once heard mentioned in 11 months of hospital compliance briefings. "There has been a records discrepancy regarding his death certificate that requires immediate federal review. We have authorization to transport him to a secure facility for evaluation." "I was not informed of any federal transfer," the charge nurse said, reaching for the phone. "Administrator Whitfield has already been briefed and has signed off on the transfer paperwork." The second man produced a folder, sliding it across the desk with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this exact motion many times before. "We would appreciate expedience. Patient transport windows are time-sensitive given his condition." Harper watched the exchange from the nurses' station down the hall, close enough to hear every word, and felt the details align themselves into a pattern she recognized instantly. Federal Medical Oversight Divisions did not operate through unmarked transport authorizations filed under shell company names. Genuine federal transfers did not arrive with folders instead of digital authorization codes cross-referenced through hospital compliance software. And no legitimate agency moved a critical care patient with a heart rhythm this fragile without first consulting the treating physician directly. She caught Bishop's eye across the corridor and gave the smallest shake of her head. He understood immediately, melting back toward the stairwell without a word, the way a man moved when he had spent years learning to disappear from a room before anyone noticed him leaving it. "I need to verify this authorization with Dr. Pierce before any transfer occurs," the charge nurse said, reaching for the phone again. "There is no time for that," the taller man said, and something in his voice shifted, the polished federal courtesy thinning just slightly at the edges. "We have a transport window closing in 20 minutes. Harper stepped forward before the charge nurse could dial, positioning herself with deliberate casualness between the two men and the ICU doors, her posture unassuming, her voice pitched exactly as timid as it had sounded for 11 straight months. "I am so sorry, gentlemen. I just need your badge numbers for our visitor log. It will only take a moment." She reached for a clipboard, with hands that trembled just enough to look convincing, watching both men's eyes flick toward each other in a silent, irritated exchange that told her everything she needed to know about how thin their patients actually ran. "We do not have time for hospital paperwork," the second man said, moving past her toward the ICU doors. Harper's hand shot out and caught his wrist, and the transformation that happened in that single motion erased 11 months of careful smallness in less than a second. Her grip was not the grip of a frightened nurse. It was precise, controlled, applying pressure exactly where pressure would matter most, and the man's face registered genuine shock as he found himself unable to simply pull free. "Badge numbers," she said again, and her voice had dropped an octave, flat and absolutely without tremor. "Now." The taller man's hand moved toward his jacket, and Harper's peripheral vision caught the motion half a second before her conscious mind fully processed what it meant, her body already shifting weight, already calculating angles and exits the way it had been trained to calculate them long before St. Agnes Naval Hospital existed in her life at all. "Do not," she said, quiet and absolute. "There are people on this floor with cameras in every hallway, cardiac monitors 2 doors down, and a master chief who has already called hospital security and this facility's actual federal liaison office. Whatever you were sent here to finish, it is already too late to finish cleanly." Something shifted in the taller man's expression. The calculation of a professional recognizing mid-operation that the terrain had changed beneath him without warning. "You are not hospital staff," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her properly for the first time, the way a man studies an opponent rather than an obstacle. "Not really. I am exactly hospital staff. I simply happen to be very good at my job." Harper did not release his wrist. "Which badge number would you like me to start with?" The lockdown alarm sounded 30 seconds later. Bishop's doing, hospital security flooding the corridor from both directions in a wave of Navy uniforms and raised voices. And the two men's composure finally cracked entirely, the taller one wrenching his arm free of Harper's grip and breaking toward the stairwell only to find it already blocked by 2 security officers Bishop had personally briefed in the 90 seconds since he left the corridor. The second man made a half-hearted attempt to reach for the folder still sitting on the nurse's desk, as though retrieving the falsified paperwork might somehow undo the last 2 minutes, and abandoned the effort the moment 3 more officers rounded the corner behind him. What followed was not the cinematic violence Harper had half expected her body to be ready for. It was quieter than that, more clinical. Hospital security restraining both men against the wall while Bishop stood a measured distance away, his presence alone enough to keep either of them from attempting anything further. His eyes fixed on Harper, with an expression that had shifted, in the space of 90 seconds, from professional respect into something closer to recognition. Real federal credentials do not fold under a hospital visitor log request, Bishop said quietly, once the corridor had settled, once the fake agents had been secured and the ICU doors remained firmly, safely shut behind Atlas Whitmore's monitored heartbeat. You knew that before you ever asked for their badge numbers. I know a lot of things I have spent a year pretending not to know. Harper's hands, she noticed distantly, were not shaking at all. The charge nurse who had first questioned the 2 men stood frozen near the desk, staring at Harper with the particular expression of someone recalculating an entire year of assumptions in real time. You knew before they even opened that folder. I suspected. Real transport authorizations do not travel in paper folders in an age when every hospital compliance system runs on digital cross-referencing. That detail alone told me enough to buy 30 seconds. The rest told itself once I had their hands where I could see them. Dr. Pierce arrived at a near run. Deputy Administrator Whitfield trailing behind him with an expression that had lost every trace of its earlier certainty. And it was Whitfield, not Pierce, who spoke first, staring at the 2 men now zip-tied against the wall by hospital security. I signed off on a transfer that compliance verified this morning, Whitfield said, her voice unsteady in a way it had not been in her office an hour earlier. The authorization codes matched our system. Because someone with basement terminal access and Dr. Pierce's stolen credentials entered them into your system, Harper said. Marcus Hale did not throw me into that morgue as a random act of cruelty, Administrator Whitfield. I believe he was making certain nobody checked that body closely enough to notice it was still breathing. Whitfield looked, for the first time since Harper had met her, genuinely uncertain of her own footing. If that is true, this goes considerably further than a review of your conduct, Nurse Quinn. It went further than that the moment someone falsified a death certificate to move a living man out of this hospital in a body bag, Harper said. I would suggest your board start asking who authorized Meridian Secure Medical Transfer's standing contract with this facility, and how long it has existed before anyone thought to question it. The hours after the 2 fake agents were led away in restraints passed in the strange, suspended quiet that Harper remembered from every genuine crisis she had ever survived. The adrenaline draining out of a body that had spent itself completely, leaving behind an exhaustion so total it felt almost like peace. She sat outside ICU 3 for nearly an hour afterward, watching through the observation window as Atlas Whitmore's monitor traced its stubborn, climbing rhythm, and let herself, for the first time in 11 months, simply breathe without calculating who might be watching her do it. Bishop found her there, 2 cups of vending machine coffee in hand, and settled into the chair beside her without asking permission, the way a man settles beside someone he has already decided is worth staying near. You are going to have questions tonight, he said, handing her one of the cups. From the Colonel, from Pierce, probably from whatever federal investigators show up once the paperwork on those 2 men gets processed. I imagine you are already tired of being asked to explain yourself. I have spent 3 years being tired of that particular question. Harper wrapped both hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. One more night of it will not break me. No, Bishop agreed, studying her with an expression that held more warmth than his usual careful neutrality allowed. I do not imagine it will. For what it is worth, most people I have served beside would not have handled that corridor as cleanly as you did. Not without a weapon in hand, and not without more than 90 seconds to think it through. I had a clipboard, Harper said, and something almost like a laugh escaped her, exhausted and genuine. 90 seconds and a clipboard. That is what 11 months of practice buys you. Marcus Hale did not last through the afternoon before hospital security. Working alongside 2 genuine federal investigators, summoned by Bishop's actual chain of command, found the payments hidden in an account under his mother's maiden name, $11,000 deposited 2 days before Atlas Whitmore's supposed death. with a second payment scheduled for the day after his body was meant to leave St. Agnes aboard a transport that did not officially exist. Rafe Delgado and Dominic Ruiz, questioned separately, both insisted they had known nothing about the falsified paperwork, that throwing Harper onto the body had been exactly the small, ugly cruelty it appeared to be, unconnected to whatever Marcus had actually been paid to arrange. The investigators believed them, in the end, though it did nothing to soften the disciplinary and legal consequences either man now faced for what they had done regardless of their ignorance of the larger scheme. Marcus, when finally confronted with the account records, folded within 20 minutes, describing a contact who had approached him 3 months earlier, offering money in exchange for basement terminal access during specific shift windows. No questions asked, no explanation given beyond a number large enough to matter to a man drowning in medical debt from his own father's illness. He says he never asked who he was working for. The lead investigator continued, sliding a folder across the conference table toward Colonel Whitmore. He says the instructions came through an encrypted messaging application. Payment through cryptocurrency converted afterward. No names, no faces, nothing that traces back further than a username that no longer exists. Whoever arranged this covered their tracks with considerably more sophistication than a hospital orderly could manage alone. He panicked when the resuscitation happened, the investigator went on. Whoever hired him to falsify the paperwork and disable proper monitoring protocols on that terminal never accounted for a nurse checking a pulse with her bare hands instead of trusting a monitor that had been deliberately miscalibrated. Miscalibrated, Pierce repeated, and something in his voice cracked, the polish finally gone entirely. The equipment was tampered with. I called a death based on falsified readings, and I never once questioned them, because questioning them would have meant admitting I trusted a machine over my own clinical instincts. You are not the one who tampered with it, Dr. Pierce, Harper said, and meant it, though she understood the weight he would carry regardless of her forgiveness. But you are the one who has the power to make certain a review this thorough happens every time a death certificate gets signed in this hospital going forward. That is worth more than an apology to me. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. The arrogance that had defined him for 11 months finally stripped down to something smaller and more honest underneath. I will submit a formal proposal to the board. Independent secondary verification on every combat casualty transfer, cross-referenced against tampering indicators, before any death certificate is finalized. It will carry your name as the nurse who identified the gap, whether you want the credit or not. Colonel Whitmore had said very little since the 2 fake agents were led away in handcuffs, standing instead near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture Harper imagined he had held through 30 years of briefings and battlefield decisions. When he finally turned to face her, something in his bearing had changed as thoroughly as her own had changed the night before. Master Chief Bishop tells me you have combat medical training that does not appear on any nursing credential this hospital has on file, he said. He tells me the way you moved in that corridor this morning was not something learned in a classroom. Harper felt the last of her careful smallness fall away entirely. The 11 months of curved shoulders and lowered eyes, finally, fully unnecessary, in a room that had already seen exactly what her hands could do. My name was not always Harper Quinn, Colonel. Before I came to Charleston, I served as a combat corpsman attached to a naval special warfare unit, call sign Raven. I was declared killed in action after an operation that went wrong in ways I am not cleared to discuss in detail, and the identity that survived that operation was not one the Navy particularly wanted walking around reminding people what had actually happened out there. I built a new name, a new life, and I told myself I was done with all of it. She looked toward the ICU doors, toward the room where Atlas Whitmore's heart kept its stubborn, steady rhythm. Your son's medical file mentioned a scar pattern on his hands that matched men I served with a lifetime ago. I do not think that is a coincidence. I think whatever operation nearly killed him overlaps with the operation that supposedly killed me, and I think someone out there has spent years making sure neither story ever got told. Colonel Whitmore sat down slowly, the movement of a man absorbing something too large to process while standing. Killed in action, but you are sitting in front of me. The Navy issued a death notification to a family that no longer exists, for reasons that still are not entirely mine to explain, even now. Harper's voice stayed even, though something beneath it had gone quiet and raw in a way 11 months of careful control had never quite managed to bury. What I can tell you is that 11 men came home from an operation that should have cost considerably more lives than it did, and that the official record credits their survival to circumstances that were not, strictly speaking, accurate. I was the circumstance the record left out. I have spent 3 years since then learning how to disappear so thoroughly that even the people who might have wanted to thank me could never find me to do it. Bishop, standing near the door, exhaled slowly, something settling behind his eyes that looked very much like recognition finally completing itself. "Raven," he said quietly, "I served under a commander who spoke about a corpsman with that call sign exactly once, in a tone I had never heard him use before or since. He said she saved 11 men in a single night, and then the Navy erased every record of her existing. I did not believe the story was literal until this moment. It was literal enough." Harper's voice stayed steady, though something behind her eyes had gone raw in a way 11 months of hiding had never quite managed to erase. "I did not save Atlas because I recognized old scars on his hands, Colonel. I saved him because that is what I do, whether the Navy issues me a call sign for it or not. But I will not pretend the two things are unconnected, and I think you deserve to know that before this conversation goes any further." "Why erase you?" Pierce asked quietly, the first question he had managed since Harper began speaking. "If you saved 11 men, why would anyone want that story buried instead of celebrated? Because the operation those 11 men survived was never supposed to happen in the location it happened in, Dr. Pierce. Officially, my unit was somewhere else entirely that night, doing something considerably less complicated than what actually occurred. Keeping 11 living witnesses quiet is difficult. Erasing the one person whose survival depended on details the official story could not accommodate is considerably easier." Harper's jaw tightened, the only outward sign of how much the words cost her to say aloud after 3 years of silence. "I do not know if Atlas remembers enough of that night to be dangerous to whoever wants it buried. I do not know if that is why someone tried to make certain he never woke up to answer questions about it. But I intend to find out, and I no longer intend to do it while pretending to be smaller than I am." Colonel Whitmore crossed the room in 3 steps and extended his hand. Not the gesture of a superior officer, but of a father who understood, finally and completely, exactly what he owed the woman standing in front of him. "I called you a stranger who ruined my son's chances, Nurse Quinn. I was wrong about almost everything I said to you in that hallway, and I do not have adequate words for what I owe you instead." "You owe me nothing, Colonel. Atlas is alive. That is the only ledger I am keeping." "She was never hiding weakness," Bishop said quietly, to no one in particular, watching Harper the way a man watches someone he has just fully understood for the first time. "She was hiding command." The formal review into Harper's conduct dissolved within the week, replaced by a considerably more urgent review into how a hired informant had gained access to falsify federal medical documentation inside a naval hospital and into which private contractors had paid for it. Deputy Administrator Whitfield resigned before the board could convene a hearing on her own oversight failures. Her resignation letter citing personal reasons that satisfied no one who had watched the last week unfold. Marcus Hale, Rafe Delgado, and Dominic Ruiz faced charges considerably more serious than a cruel prank in a morgue, though only Marcus had known the true weight of what he had been paid to help conceal. The investigation into Meridian Secure Medical Transfer stretched on for months after Harper's involvement officially ended, federal agents tracing the shell company through 3 separate jurisdictions before the trail went cold behind layers of corporate structuring that Bishop's contacts described in careful language as considerably more sophisticated than a single corrupt orderly could have arranged alone. Bishop kept Harper informed of what he could share through channels that existed somewhere between official and personal, and though the deepest source of the conspiracy remained unresolved, the immediate threat to Atlas Whitmore, and to whatever knowledge he carried from that night 3 years earlier, had been contained. "They will not stop looking," Bishop told her, weeks later, standing at the edge of the hospital parking lot in the grey light of early evening. "Whoever ordered this will regroup, and they will try something else, eventually, somewhere else. People like that do not simply walk away. Then we will be ready when they try." Harper looked back at the hospital behind them, its windows lit against the darkening sky, and felt something settle in her chest that had not settled in 3 long years. "I spent a lifetime disappearing so nobody could find me to hurt me again. I am done disappearing, Bishop. Whatever comes next, I intend to meet it standing up." Harper visited Atlas Whitmore 3 weeks later, on the day he was finally cleared to leave St. Agnes under his own power, his father beside him, Bishop standing near the door, the way he had stood near every doorway since the night everything changed. They tell me you carried me back from somewhere I was not supposed to return from, Atlas said, his voice still thin but steady, his eyes holding the particular clarity of a man who understood exactly what had almost happened to him. Twice, apparently. Once out there, and once in a morgue in Charleston. I only handled the second one. Harper allowed herself something she had not allowed in 11 months. A small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. The first one was on you. They also tell me your call sign was Raven. Atlas studied her carefully, the way a man studies a face he is trying to place against a memory buried too deep to reach cleanly. I do not remember much from that night. Fragments, mostly. A voice telling me to breathe, telling me I was not allowed to die on someone else's watch. I always assumed I imagined it. Some trick my mind played to survive the worst hour of my life. You did not imagine it. Harper's voice softened, though it did not waver. I did not know if you would ever remember. Part of me hoped you would not have to. I am glad I did not remember for 3 years. Atlas reached for his father's arm, steadying himself as he stood fully upright for the first time in weeks. But I am gladder still that the voice belonged to someone who found me again. Twice. When it mattered most. Administrators offered her a formal commendation, a transfer to a specialized trauma unit, even a quiet suggestion that her particular skill set might interest certain federal contacts Bishop apparently still maintained. Harper declined the transfer and declined the contacts, though she accepted the commendation on the condition that it never mention her former call sign in any public document. She had spent a lifetime being Raven in places that demanded silence about it. She intended to spend whatever came next, simply being Harper Quinn, a nurse at St. Agnes Naval Hospital, in a city that finally, for the first time in 11 months, felt like somewhere she could stand up straight. She did agree to one thing beyond her regular duties, a weekly session training incoming staff on recognizing tampered vitals and combat casualty patterns most civilian nursing programs never covered. Taught in a conference room down the hall from the ICU, where Atlas Whitmore had once been declared gone. Dr. Pierce attended every session personally, seated near the front rather than at the back where his rank might have allowed him to observe from a comfortable distance. He took notes the way a resident might, asking questions without the defensive edge that had defined his voice for 11 months. And within a month he had authored the formal proposal he promised Harper in that first conference room, an independent secondary verification protocol for every combat casualty transfer through St. Agnes, cross-referenced against known tampering indicators before any death certificate could be finalized. The board adopted it unanimously, and within the year, 2 other naval hospitals in the region had requested copies of the protocol for their own compliance offices. I built a career on being the smartest person in every room, Pierce told her. After one of the sessions, lingering by the door the way a man lingers when he has something to say and has not yet decided how to say it. It took a nurse I dismissed for 11 months teaching me the most important lesson of that career. That being smart is worthless if you are too arrogant to question a monitor reading that does not match what the room is telling you. You are not the villain of this story, Dr. Pierce. Harper began gathering her training materials, the same clipboard she had once used to buy 30 crucial seconds in a hospital corridor. You made an assumption that turned out to be wrong, under pressure, with falsified data feeding you a lie designed specifically to be believed. The men who wanted you to believe it built their entire plan around your competence, not your incompetence. That distinction matters. It matters because a hospital that punishes competence for being deceived teaches its best physicians to stop trusting their own instincts entirely. And that lesson costs more lives in the long run than the one mistake ever could. It matters to my conscience considerably less than you might think. Pierce managed something that might, in a better light, have passed for a smile. But it helps to hear it from you all the same. Colonel Whitmore attended the first session without being asked, sitting quietly in the back row like any other student. And when Harper caught his eye across the room, he gave her a small, respectful nod that said more than 30 years of command voice ever could have. He returned for every session after that, month after month, never speaking during the training itself, simply present, a father who had learned, in the worst week of his life, exactly what it meant to be wrong about someone, and exactly what it meant to make that wrongness right through action rather than words alone. Atlas Whitmore visited St. Agnes twice more before his medical clearance returned him fully to active status, each time finding Harper during her shift, each time sitting with her for a few quiet minutes in the cafeteria that had, months earlier, been the site of nothing more than her careful, invisible routine. He never asked her to return to the life she had left behind, and she never offered, though something passed between them in those conversations that resembled the particular respect of people who had once trusted each other with the only thing that mattered in the worst moment either of them had lived through. Charleston did not know the full story of what happened at St. Agnes Naval Hospital that spring, and Harper preferred it that way. The version that reached the local news mentioned an administrative oversight, a corrected death certificate, a hospital that had strengthened its verification protocols following an internal review. It did not mention Marcus Hale's basement terminal, or Meridian Secure Medical Transfer, or a corpsman named Raven, who had once saved 11 men and been erased for it. Harper read the brief sanitized article once, folded the newspaper closed, and went back to her rounds, because the truth she carried did not need a headline to be real. And some truths were worth more kept close than shared with strangers who would never understand the weight of them. She did not need his apology anymore. She had already given herself something better than that. The simple, hard-won permission to stand in a room and let people see exactly who she was. The end. If this story kept you watching until the very last second, do us a favor and hit like, subscribe to Silent Badge's Stories, and leave a comment telling us which line hit you hardest, because your support is what brings the next hidden hero out of the shadows.